long before its name became a familiar label on grocery store shelves, before it was reduced to a bottle quietly waiting on a kitchen table, the Heinz Factory stood as a silent authority over Pittsburgh. It was not merely a place where food was produced. It was a place where industrial America learned how to trust what it consumed. Rising along the rivers of a steel city, its walls enclosed a system built on precision, discipline, and repetition. A system that would quietly redefine how an entire nation understood safety, cleanliness, and control. Inside this factory, tomatoes were processed with the same efficiency as people. Thousands of workers moved in synchronization with machines that never seemed to rest, their lives calibrated to whistles, shifts, and conveyor belts that dictated when to arrive, when to leave, and how fast to move. Heinz was not only selling ketchup, it was selling certainty, it was selling order, and it was selling reassurance. In an era when Americans were deeply afraid of contamination, disease, and the invisible chaos they believed lurked behind factory walls. The factory projected an image of purity and progress that was carefully curated and relentlessly enforced. Shining floors, spotless uniforms, glass bottles, and visible production lines created the illusion of transparency, while quietly exercising control over time, behavior, and labor. Entire neighborhoods grew around its gates, dependent on its wages, shaped by its schedules, and bound to its continued success. For generations, to work at Heinz was not simply employment. It was identity, status, and belonging within an industrial city that demanded endurance above all else. But power in America has rarely been loyal to place. As the Heinz brand grew larger than the building that had created it, the factory's central importance began to fade. Production slowed, decisions moved elsewhere, and eventually, the machines that once defined daily life fell silent. Today, Heinz products still dominate American kitchens, unchanged in taste, appearance, and branding. Yet the factory that gave the brand its authority has been stripped of its voice. What remains is an uncomfortable silence and a question that echoes through American industrial history. When a company becomes global, what happens to the city that built it? That question begins with the man behind the factory. Henry John Heinz was not simply an owner or an entrepreneur. He was the architect of a system that decided how power would quietly operate inside industrial America. Born in 1844 to German immigrant parents, Heinz was shaped by a household defined by discipline, Protestant morality, and an unwavering belief that order was the foundation of success. From an early age, he learned that cleanliness was not merely a habit, but a declaration of character, and that control, when framed correctly, was not cruelty, but responsibility. Long before the Heinz factory dominated Pittsburgh's industrial landscape, Heinz understood something fundamental about the American public at the turn of the 20th century. People were afraid. They feared industrial food. They feared contamination. They feared unseen dangers hidden behind brick walls and steel doors. While other manufacturers focused on scale, speed, and profit, Heinz focused on trust, and more importantly, on how trust could be engineered. He did not present himself as a ruthless industrialist. He presented himself as a moral figure, a protector of the public against the excesses of modern industry. This belief became the foundation of the factory itself. Spotless floors, carefully organized production lines, and workers dressed in white transformed food production into a performance of purity. Journalists, government officials, and reformers were invited inside to witness what appeared to be a revolutionary model of ethical manufacturing. Glass walls and open layouts sent a clear message. This was a factory with nothing to hide. But transparency in Heinz's world was never neutral. It was strategic. Beneath the surface of cleanliness and progress existed a system built on absolute discipline. Heinz believed that to maintain trust, every variable had to be controlled, including the people who worked for him. The factory functioned not only as a site of production, but as a mechanism of behavioral regulation. Workers were expected to follow strict codes governing how they dressed, how they spoke, and how they conducted themselves both inside and outside the factory gates. Personal behavior was treated as a reflection of the brand itself, and deviation was viewed not as individuality, but as risk. Welfare programs, dining halls, and recreational facilities were celebrated publicly as evidence of compassion. Yet these benefits also served to keep workers within a carefully monitored environment where loyalty could be observed, reinforced, and measured. In Heinz's view, stability required supervision, and care required authority. The factory became an extension of the man himself, a physical manifestation of his belief that efficiency without obedience was dangerous. Thousands of workers passed through its gates, many grateful for steady employment in an unpredictable industrial economy, yet slowly absorbed into a culture where gratitude was expected and autonomy quietly diminished. Heinz did not rule through fear. He ruled through structure, routine, and the promise of protection. Over time, his personal ideology hardened into institutional practice, embedding discipline, cleanliness, and conformity into architecture, management systems, and daily schedules that would long outlive the man himself. To the American public, Henry J. Heinz became a symbol of enlightened capitalism, proof that industry could be both profitable and ethical. His image was carefully cultivated through advertising and public appearances that portrayed him as a benevolent patriarch rather than a corporate strategist. Inside the factory, however, his legacy was more complex. Workers experienced opportunity and constraint, pride and submission, security and surveillance all at once. The owner behind the factory was never distant or abstract. His influence was constant, shaping behavior through policy rather than force, expectation rather than command. In doing so, Heinz demonstrated one of the most enduring truths of American industrial history. Power does not always arrive as domination. Sometimes it arrives as care. And the systems that promise protection often demand the deepest forms of obedience in return. Pittsburgh was never chosen for romance, tradition, or culinary heritage. It was chosen because it was a city already trained to obey industry. At the turn of the 20th century, Pittsburgh existed as one of the most aggressively industrialized environments in America, a landscape shaped not by comfort or beauty, but by output. Steel mills dominated the skyline. Rail corridors cut through neighborhoods like scars. Rivers functioned less as natural features and more as arteries of extraction, carrying raw materials in and finished products out with mechanical efficiency. Smoke permanently darkened the sky. Noise defined the rhythm of daily life. Time itself was organized around shifts, whistles, and production quotas that treated human hours as property owned by factories. This was a city engineered for endurance, not ease, and that reality made it uniquely attractive to Henry J. Heinz. Geography offered immediate logistical advantages. The convergence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers created a transportation network unmatched in its efficiency. Agricultural goods could arrive cheaply and in overwhelming volume, while finished products could be distributed nationwide with speed and precision. Rail lines reinforced this system, slicing through residential areas and binding everyday life directly to industrial infrastructure. In Pittsburgh, the boundary between home and factory was already thin, but logistics alone did not make the city essential. Pittsburgh's true value lay in its people. The city was densely populated by immigrant labor from Germany, Eastern Europe, Italy, and Austro-Hungarian regions. These were workers accustomed to rigid hierarchy, long hours, and limited bargaining power. Economic survival left little room for resistance. Labor was abundant, replaceable, and conditioned by an environment where submission to machines and schedules was not questioned, but normalized. In this setting, discipline did not need to be enforced aggressively. It was already culturally embedded. The city's identity as a steel capital also created a contrast that Heinz quietly exploited. Compared to the lethal heat, physical danger, and visible brutality of the mills, food production appeared almost gentle. Clean floors, glass bottles, and white uniforms stood in stark opposition to soot-covered furnaces and scarred bodies. This contrast allowed the Heinz factory to present itself as humane and progressive, while operating within the same industrial logic of control, repetition, and efficiency. Workers did not measure their conditions against autonomy or freedom. They measured them against the mills, and by that comparison, gratitude replaced resistance. The city itself reinforced this dynamic. Local government depended heavily on industrial employment and corporate tax revenue, creating a political environment where large employers faced minimal scrutiny. Urban planning evolved around factories rather than communities. Housing clustered near work sites, schools adapted to shift schedules. Public life unconsciously aligned itself with industrial time. Even pollution played an unspoken role. The constant haze lowered expectations, masked inequality, and created a shared sense of sacrifice that muted individual grievances. Everyone endured something, and endurance became a civic virtue. For Heinz, this environment provided insulation. A city accustomed to hardship was unlikely to question control when it was framed as order, or discipline when it was presented as care. The rivers that once carried steel now carried bottled food, but the underlying logic remained unchanged. Extract value, regulate labor, move product, maintain stability. Over time, the Heinz factory embedded itself into Pittsburgh's economic nervous system, not as an intruder, but as a stabilizing presence within an unstable world. Employment at Heinz offered relative safety, predictability, and dignity within a city defined by danger and exhaustion. That perception strengthened loyalty and reduced dissent. Workers internalized the belief that survival required acceptance, and acceptance required conformity. In choosing Pittsburgh, Heinz did more than select a location. He selected a mindset shaped by dependence, endurance, and resignation. The city's industrial DNA allowed the factory to function not merely as a workplace, but as an institution capable of governing time, behavior, and expectation without overt force. And when the brand eventually grew powerful enough to detach itself from the city that had sustained it, Pittsburgh was left with a realization shared by countless American industrial towns. It was never chosen to be preserved. It was chosen to be efficient, for as long as it remained useful. The Heinz factory was never designed to feel human, because its true purpose was not to accommodate people, but to absorb them. From the moment construction began in Pittsburgh, the factory was envisioned as a closed system where raw materials, time, and labor could be synchronized into a single, uninterrupted flow. Every wall, corridor, and production floor was shaped by this logic. Comfort was secondary. Flexibility was unnecessary. What mattered was movement, precision, and repetition. Tomatoes arrived by rail and river in overwhelming volume, poured into processing zones where sorting, washing, and crushing followed rigid, predetermined sequences. Vinegar, salt, sugar, glass, and metal moved through separate channels, converging only when the system demanded it. Each stage of production was isolated, measured, and timed, so that no part of the process relied on human judgment longer than absolutely necessary. Machines defined the pace. People adapted themselves to it. Conveyor belts replaced walking. Bells replaced conversation. Schedules replaced intuition. Workstations were positioned to limit unnecessary motion, forcing bodies into repetitive gestures that could be sustained for hours without deviation. Over time, these movements became automatic, etched into muscle memory, reducing labor to a mechanical extension of the production line. The factory did not train workers to think, it trained them to repeat. Heinz invested aggressively in mechanization, not only to increase efficiency, but to eliminate unpredictability. Machines did not question instructions, grow tired, or improvise. Workers were expected to meet the same standard. Skill was valued only insofar as it reinforced consistency. Creativity had no place in a system built to produce identical results millions of times over. Cleanliness, the most visible symbol of the Heinz brand, was inseparable from this machinery of control. Floors were polished, tools were sanitized, uniforms were kept immaculate, not only to reassure the public, but to enforce internal discipline. Dirt suggested disorder, and disorder threatened efficiency. Bright lighting eliminated shadows. Glass walls eliminated privacy. Open layouts ensured that every movement was observable, even when no supervisor was nearby. Visibility became a form of quiet supervision. Workers learned quickly that nothing they did went unseen. The architecture itself enforced compliance. Time and motion studies dissected tasks into their smallest components, identifying wasted seconds and unnecessary pauses. Each refinement tightened the system further, compressing human effort into shorter, more intense cycles of output. Breaks were regulated, transitions minimized, silence encouraged. The factory did not rush, but it never slowed. Its rhythm was relentless, indifferent to fatigue, emotion, or circumstance. As weeks turned into years, the machine reshaped the people inside it. Bodies adapted to standing, lifting, reaching, and repeating. Minds adjusted to monotony. Days lost distinction, measured not by calendar events, but by shifts completed and quotas met. Outside the factory walls, life reorganized itself around production. Families planned meals around work hours. Sleep followed factory time. Entire neighborhoods adjusted their routines to match the flow of output. The influence of the system extended far beyond the building itself, quietly governing how time was experienced throughout the city. Hierarchy inside the factory was absolute. Management observed, measured, and optimized. Labor complied. Authority did not need to announce itself because it was embedded directly into the structure of work. A worker who slowed the line did not merely disrupt production. They threatened the stability of the entire system. Discipline was enforced subtly through reassignment, reduced hours, or silent replacement. The message was clear without ever being spoken. The machine would continue with or without you. To outside visitors, the Heinz factory appeared modern, rational, even admirable. A demonstration of American efficiency and technical mastery. To those inside, it was total. It demanded attention, precision, and submission, absorbing individual effort into a collective motion that left no room for pause or reflection. Building the food machine was not simply an industrial achievement. It was a social experiment in control, a demonstration that with enough structure, the visibility, and repetition, human labor could be shaped to mirror the predictability of the products it created. The Heinz factory was never intended to function like a normal workplace. It was designed to operate beyond the limits of human rest, transforming continuous motion into its defining principle. Once the system reached full scale, de Besanstein begins to work on. The factory rejected the natural rhythm of day and night and replaced it with an artificial order governed entirely by production. While Pittsburgh outside still followed sunrise, sunset, seasons, and weather, the world inside the factory existed in a permanent state of wakefulness. Shifts were engineered to overlap with near-perfect precision so that machines never cooled and conveyor belts never stopped. As one group of workers clocked out, another stepped in immediately, inheriting the same pace, the same posture, and the same expectations as if no human transition had occurred at all. Artificial lighting flooded the production floors, flattening time and erasing visual cues that distinguished morning from midnight. The constant mechanical hum filled every space, eliminating silence so completely that stillness itself began to feel unnatural. Even during hours when output slowed, the factory remained alert. Maintenance crews moved through corridors at night, cleaning equipment, repairing belts, recalibrating machines, and preparing the system for the next uninterrupted cycle. The message was implicit but unmistakable. The factory must always be ready because readiness was the foundation of power. Workers learned quickly that their bodies were expected to conform to this logic. Night shifts were not framed as temporary sacrifices, but as normalized obligations, quietly redefining what endurance meant. Sleep became fragmented. Meals became irregular. Personal life was compressed into narrow gaps between shifts. Fatigue was never acknowledged as a structural consequence of non-stop production. It was treated as an individual failure to adapt. Management rarely needed to issue threats or raise voices. The schedule itself functioned as discipline. Rotating shifts prevented long-term stability while maintaining output, keeping workers disoriented enough to comply, but functional enough to continue. Over time, the absence of rest reshaped perception itself. Days blurred together. Weeks lost distinction. Memory shortened as repetition replaced variation. Life outside the factory began to feel distant and secondary, something briefly accessed before being pulled back into the rhythm of production. Families adjusted their lives around factory time rather than the other way around. Meals were eaten alone at odd hours. Conversations were shortened by exhaustion. Relationships bent under the weight of irregular sleep and constant absence. In neighborhoods surrounding the plant, windows glowed deep into the night as households adapted to night work, early mornings, and unpredictable schedules. The factory's insomnia spread outward, quietly governing the biological clock of the city itself. To the outside world, this non-stop operation symbolized strength, reliability, and abundance. A factory that never slept appeared powerful, modern, and indispensable, capable of feeding a nation without pause. Inside the walls, however, the experience was far more complicated. Constant motion left little space for reflection, dissent, or even boredom. Repetition dulled awareness. Exhaustion reduced resistance. Workers learned to function automatically, guided by routine rather than purpose, sustained by habit rather than choice. The system did not require constant supervision because the rhythm enforced compliance on its own. Those who could not endure eventually vanished from the line, replaced without ceremony by others willing or forced to adapt to the same cycle. The factory recognized no individual limits, only continuity. Silence was treated as waste, stillness as inefficiency, rest as vulnerability. In this way, the Heinz factory became more than a site of production. It became a self-sustaining organism that consumed human time around the clock and converted it into predictable output. A factory that never slept did not merely produce food, it produced endurance, resignation, and a quiet understanding that in industrial America, value was measured not by how well one lived, but by how long one could remain awake and useful within the machine. The moment Heinz stopped thinking of itself as a factory and began thinking of itself as infrastructure was the moment it truly began feeding a nation. By the early 20th century, Heinz was no longer producing food merely for Pittsburgh or even for regional markets. It was inserting itself into the daily survival of American households at a scale few companies had ever achieved. Rail cars left the factory loaded with bottled ketchup, pickles, sauces, and preserved goods, traveling across a country still learning how to function as a unified economic system. these products reached cities, mining towns, frontier settlements, and military supply depots, offering something that felt revolutionary in an unstable era: consistency. In a nation defined by distance, inequality, and uncertainty, Heinz promised that food would taste the same everywhere, every time. That promise carried immense power. To feed a nation was not simply to supply calories, it was to standardize experience, to quietly shape habits, expectations, and trust. Families built meals around Heinz products without knowing where they came from, only that they were reliable. The factory's output became embedded in American routines, appearing on dinner tables, in lunch pails, and eventually inside institutions such as schools, hospitals, and the military. During periods of economic stress and social change, the brand positioned itself as a stabilizing force, a symbol of order in a rapidly industrializing world. Advertising reinforced this role relentlessly. Heinz was not presented as a corporation, but as a guardian of family life, health, and tradition. Behind these images, the scale of production expanded without pause. Feeding a nation required uninterrupted flow, and uninterrupted flow demanded sacrifice that remained largely invisible to consumers. As Heinz grew, the relationship between production and consumption became increasingly abstract. Americans trusted the product without ever seeing the process. Workers lived inside the process without sharing in the trust it generated. The factory became a point of origin disconnected from its consequences, while the brand became omnipresent and detached from place. National distribution transformed Heinz into a political and economic force. Supplying food at scale required negotiation with railroads, influence over agricultural practices, and alignment with government standards. Heinz helped shape early food regulation, not purely out of altruism, but to reinforce its dominance and eliminate competitors unable to meet its requirements. By defining what safe and pure food looked like, Heinz effectively defined who could participate in the national market. Smaller producers disappeared, absorbed or eliminated by an industrial model they could not replicate. Feeding a nation meant centralizing power. The Pittsburgh factory became one node in a growing network, but it remained symbolic. It was the place where national nourishment had first been industrialized. During times of war and mobilization, Heinz's role intensified. Food production became a patriotic act. The factory's nonstop output was reframed as national service. Workers were told, implicitly and explicitly, that their exhaustion supported something larger than themselves. This narrative further suppressed resistance and justified sacrifice. To question conditions was to question contribution. Over time, the sheer scale of feeding a nation altered how Americans understood food itself. Meals became standardized, shelf-stable, and increasingly divorced from local agriculture or seasonal variation. Heinz did not create this transformation alone, but it perfected it. The factory became a model for how industrial food could replace regional identity with national uniformity. Consumers benefited from reliability and convenience, while losing awareness of origin, labor, and cost. Feeding a nation required invisibility of workers, of fatigue, of the machinery that made abundance possible. The success of the system depended on distance, both physical and psychological, between those who consumed and those who produced. As long as shelves remained full, questions remained unasked. Heinz continued to expand output, refine logistics, and reinforce the illusion that abundance was effortless and permanent. But feeding a nation also meant binding that nation to a system that could never afford to stop. Dependency spread quietly. Cities relied on wages. Railroads relied on volume. Agriculture reshaped itself around industrial demand. Feeding a nation became inseparable from controlling it, subtly, quietly, and without spectacle. By the time Heinz reached the height of its power, Americans no longer questioned where their food came from. The answer seemed obvious. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The factory faded into abstraction while the brand became permanent. Feeding a nation was no longer a function, it was an assumption. And like all assumptions in industrial America, it rested on a system that could never slow down, never pause, and never admit the cost of keeping the machine alive. Order inside the Heinz factory was never accidental, and discipline was never optional. Together, they formed an invisible architecture that allowed the entire system to function without resistance. From the earliest years of large-scale production, Heinz understood that machines alone could not guarantee consistency. People had to be regulated just as carefully as equipment. Rules were therefore not treated as guidelines, but as structural necessities woven into every layer of daily life. Workers entered a world governed by clearly defined expectations: how to dress, how to speak, how to move, how to behave both on the factory floor and beyond it. Clean uniforms were mandatory, not merely for hygiene, but as a visual declaration of conformity. Appearance became a form of discipline, signaling obedience before any labor was performed. Inside the plant, behavior was standardized through routines so precise that deviation became immediately visible. Movement followed prescribed paths. Tasks followed fixed sequences. Time was divided into measurable units that left little room for personal discretion. Supervisors did not need to intervene constantly because the rules were embedded into the environment itself. Architecture, lighting, and layout directed attention and controlled motion, turning space into an instrument of authority. Silence was encouraged. Conversation was limited. Distraction was discouraged. The message was clear without being spoken. Work required total focus and total submission. Discipline extended beyond productivity into morality. Heinz promoted codes of conduct that framed personal behavior as a reflection of corporate integrity. Workers were expected to embody respectability, sobriety, and restraint, values that aligned perfectly with the company's public image of purity and order. Welfare programs, educational initiatives, and recreational facilities were offered as benefits, but they also functioned as mechanisms of oversight. By shaping how workers spent their free time, the company reduced opportunities for dissent and reinforced loyalty beyond the factory floor. The system presented itself as benevolent, offering stability and support in exchange for compliance. That support, however, came with conditions. Gratitude was expected. Dissent was discouraged. Independence quietly eroded. Rules were enforced not through spectacle or punishment, but through subtle consequences. Assignments changed. Hours were adjusted. Opportunities were quietly withdrawn. Discipline operated through anticipation rather than fear, teaching workers to regulate themselves long before correction was demanded. Over time, this system produced a workforce that internalized control. Obedience no longer required supervision because it became habitual. Workers learned to measure themselves against expectations, correcting behavior automatically to avoid disruption. The factory extended its authority beyond actions and into perception, shaping what felt normal, acceptable, and necessary. Outside the factory gates, the influence of order and discipline persisted. Workers carried routines home, structuring family life, sleep, and social interaction around industrial schedules and moral expectations. Neighborhoods reflected this culture, marked by predictability, restraint, and quiet endurance. The rules of the factory became the rules of life. From the company's perspective, this system was efficient and ethical. It reinforced Heinz's reputation as a responsible employer and moral enterprise. To the public, it appeared as enlightened capitalism in action. Beneath the surface, however, discipline functioned as a form of power that left little room for autonomy. The cost of order was uniformity. The price of stability was submission. Individual needs became secondary to systemic demands, and personal expression was sacrificed for collective efficiency. The factory did not need to coerce openly because its rules shaped behavior long before conflict emerged. By the time workers questioned the system, they were already embedded within it. Order, rules, and discipline allowed Heinz to operate at scale, feeding a nation with predictable output. But they also revealed a deeper truth about industrial power. Control was most effective when it appeared reasonable, when obedience felt voluntary, and when discipline masqueraded as care. In the Heinz factory, order was not merely maintained. It was cultivated, normalized, and absorbed, proving that the strongest systems of control are those that teach people to enforce them on themselves.